The Fields by Conrad Richter. Chapter 1. Lawfully Married. She moved up the trace, a strong young figure, calm, and on the deliberate side in her red-brown shawl, with her willer basket on her arm. Oh, you had to be a stout body to be a woman way back here, for this was up west in the Ohio wilderness. The trace ran through the deep woods. Here the lonesome path to the toll's improvement led off, though you couldn't see a stick cut. Back there the stumpy lane to the Covenhovens ran, just wide enough for Big John's wagon to go winding and rocking between the big butts. The trace was here before the woods lane, for the Indians had made it, or the wild bulls ahead of them. Away back before, these old butts were whips. The Shawnees claimed the wild bulls had traveled it. It ran up the river and was wide as a road, but it didn't have any sky. Only the under part of the trace was what you call clear. Harvest of old leaves covered the black ground. Overhead the trees were thick as always. Branches and vines fought and locked up there. Under them the trace was a dark green tunnel. At the other end you could just see the faint promise of light. That light was George Roebuck's clearing, and his post where Sayward was going. Outside the log store, two Shawnees lay drunk and sprawled over each other on the ground, like two copper snakes twined in their winter den, and numb to what was going on around. Inside, Buckman Tull, Jake Tench, and other white men loafed on benches or tipped back stools. Sayward passed them the time, while George Roebuck waited red as a fox behind his counter. Oh, she said nothing as yet that he had sent for her to come up. She put her basket on the counter, lifting out bunches of dried sang and slippery elm bark, tied with lin string. No use coming up here without fetching what she could along. Her sharp eye watched him weigh it, and shear off the bared flannel she would take back. That done, he looked solemn as a governor. "I've been expecting you, Saird," he said shortly. He reached around to a cubby place, like a pigeonhole, and threw something on the counter. Sayward stood there looking at it, a kind of thin, square packet of paper, lying across the salt and sugar, filled cracks of the planking. That it had come a long way was plain from the smudges of hands it had passed through, big hands, little hands, dirty hands, and a bloody hand, all leaving their thumb marks, some plumb on top of the fine handwrite. Now who would have reckoned it was a letter that the traitor had for her? Why, this was the first letter to come to her in all her born years. Through her mind ran the searching question, who could have sent it? For she knew well enough when you cracked the seal and unfolded the paper, somebody's name had to be pot-hooked at the bottom. Was that name her pappy's, she wondered? Was he still a-living away out there, a-skinning wild bulls across the great river that had winter at one end and palm orchards on the other? She could see him now, in her mind, clear as through spring water, stepping along in his gray buckskins with his long pole of a Pennsylvania rifle on his arm? Or was it Asha, her sister, sending word of herself for the first time since she ran off with Jenny's man, telling if she had young ones, and whether she and Louis still lived together, or had he run off now with some new woman? The letter felt heavy as deed paper as she picked it up in her brown fingers. Oh, this was too quality and gentle to come from Worth or Asha or any person who would write their letter for them. "You can charge the postage to me," she said. Then turned it over and saw that the blob of vermilion sealing wax had been broken. "It's my letter, Saird," the trader told her, "but since you're the one it wants to know about, I'll charge you with the postage, like you say. I didn't like to talk about you behind your back. I thought I'd read you the questions it asks. Then you could tell me what to say." Sayward's short gown flared a little in front, as it always did when she reared up so straight. "What kind of questions?" "Personal," George Roebuck said. "Have I got to answer?" "No, you don't have to." Sayward stood studying a little. "I don't even know who it's from." He took the letter from her fingers and spread it open on the counter. Then he pulled down his temple specs that made him look like a great gray-eyed frog ready to jump in the river. "He writes this letter from the Bay State. He says he's the lawyer for Porteous's mother." Sayward stood stock still. So it had come, she told herself. Porteous's folks were starting to pay interest in him and her at last. What does he want? George Roebuck's head was furry. His face had pits and hair holes. Yet you could tell he was somebody, and here in his own post, in his leather apron, he looked sovereign of all he laid eyes to. He gave her a sharp scrutiny around his spectacles. "Now you understand, Saird, I can't help for what he says. It's a lawyer's right to ask unhandy questions." Sayward looked back at him without winking. No, he couldn't help for it as he said. But he could shoo off some of these loafers sitting around to listen. Not that she would ask him. "You can go ahead and read it," she said. A look she well knew came into George Roebuck's face. She had given him leaf. Now she would have to take it as it came. "He wants to know," the trader put to her, "is it true that Porteous Wheeler is living out here with a woods girl?" That's his first question. Sayward felt a slow thump somewhere inside her, but outside she held cool and steady. "You can say it's true," she said clearly. "Is it true he wants to know that you can't read or write?" Sayward hung her head. "You know it's true," she said in a low voice. "Now he says, is it true," the trader went on, "that you and Porteous are living together? This is how he puts it, without benefit of laws or clergy." "That's not true." Sayward looked him in the eye. "You know your own self. We're lawfully married." "I'm just sayin' what he says here," George Roebuck reminded her. "He says he heard men under the influence of whiskey forced Porteous to stand up with you, and he had no other way but marry you." Back of Sayward came the bang of a stool fallen over on the puncheons. Who says I was under the influence of whiskey? Jake Tench demanded. I can drink a hogshead and never feel it. Hush up, Jake, Sayward told him curtly. You only make it worse. She had not turned around. Her eyes met George Roebuck's as hard as flints. You can say it's true. He had no choice. You gave him the choice afterward, Saird, Jake Tench reminded her angrily. I was R&C'd you. You opened the door and told him he could go or stay. The letter don't ask about afterwards, Sayward said. Why don't you tell him then how Porteous was afore you married him? Jake shouted. How much would they ha' thought of him then? Sayward's face grew cruel. In her mind she could see Porteous as he was when first he came to the woods. A dandy then, and no mistake, with a whole caisson, they said, of shirts and fixins. Nobody knew why he came away back here all alone, but every 2 weeks he went to Roebuck's looking for a letter. She could see him afterwards, too, when all hope of that letter had gone, looking like a bush nipple. You never would have reckoned that Shaggy Woodsy in shoe packs was a Bay State lawyer who could say by heart anything he wanted out of the Bible, the poetry books, or the Constitution. His seamed buckskin breeches had the legs shrunk and dried hard as boards, so that they went clap-clap when he walked. He lived in a log shanty of buckeye logs, for they were the easiest to cut down. Seldom saw he a human face, save his own staring up at him from some wild run, or heard a voice, save the frog's wild croaking. But now that a woman had gone and married him, coaxed him back to be a human again, and got him to practicing his law business, his Bay State relations, wanted to know about this woman, and was she good enough for him? No, she said darkly, you'll say nothin' to his ma'am how he was then. Like you say, Saird, the less to write, the better it suited George Roebuck. Here's the last he wants to know. He says the business that made Porteous leave back there is settled now. Porteous's family want him to come home and practice law in the Bay State. They've written to him, they say, but he doesn't answer. Is it his woman they want to know, who's holding him back and keeping him from coming home? He looked at her over his lenses like a red owl. No, I ain't a-holdin' him back, Sayward said. You can tell them so. Porteous never said nothin' to me. Why don't you go along back with him? Buckman Toll put in. It was mighty still in the post, and none was quieter than Sayward herself. Oh, she would give a good deal to be back there long enough to catch sight of Porteous's folks. She'd like to lay her eyes on another too. Many a time she felt sure it had a woman at the bottom of Porteous's burying himself out in the woods. She would like to get a look at that woman he thought so much of, but Sayward showed none of that in her face. You might think she was cold-blooded, the stony way she stood there. They ain't asked me, she said after a minute, but if they did, I'd never go back yar. You could live in a mansion house likely, Jake Tench called to her. You'd have a coachman to drive you around. No, Sayward told the trader, Me and Porteus came out here in the woods, and here's whar we aim to make our stake. You can say I said so, you can say I'm willful too, and set in my ways." Then she put her basket on her arm and made her way to the door. It was getting late, she told herself, when she got outside. The sun must be pretty close to down, for the forest wall threw shadows clean across the cleared ground. The two Shawnees still lay struck by jugged lightning. Will Beagle's bear cub had crawled out of his low log shelter and was trying to reach them with one claw, but his chain wouldn't let him go that far. Oh, she could talk big enough about the woods, but it wasn't all cake and pie to live in them. It had grown mighty dark on the trace. Deep in the forest she could see the last melancholy rays of the sun like red deal's candles. Now they faded out, and the woods were blackened still. This was the time the night air started coming out under the trees, and small bodies of mist to rise and float close to earth. Why mist came from certain spots in the ground, nobody knew, but even in the black dark you could taste its cold breath when you passed through. By day the woods seemed more open. In the morning light you could see deer paths and traces running this way and that, openings and galleries through the leafage, and cubby holes and recesses between the great pillars. You could look up and see through hole after hole in the branches overhead, till way up there you could tell must be sky, for the leaves were bright with sun. But at sundown the woods thickened. Oh, if you went in there and counted, there would be no more buts than before, but when you looked back from the trace, it had got thicker again. All around you could feel the woods swarming and crowding butt to butt, with branches matted and braided, all shrouded with moss, older than the wild bull's trails and dark as midnight, running on and on a slew of miles you couldn't count, over hills and bottoms and soft oozy swamps, north to the English lakes, and west to the big prairies. That was a power of woods at night to feel around you. It was good to come out in her own clearing where it still had some light left, and to tramp clear of the trees. The only thing left of the big butts in here was their stumps, and that was their best part, for the stumps couldn't shut you in, and you could grow life-giving crops around them. Yes, and it had one more thing left of the trees. That was their brush cut and piled over yonder. Those limbs a-drying and leaves a-dying would block out no more sun from her or her ground. They made a pleasing sight to a settler, for the best way such liked the trees was down, with their arms slashed off and ready for burning. The sweetest sound to a human deep in these woods was the hard whack of the axe, cutting or splitting, trimming or hewing, ringing a long ways through the timber, till all the trees around knew what was coming to them. She stopped in the dusk to look about her clearing. Open sky hung above, but the woods never went far off. They stood just over yonder, with their walls black against the sky. Her corn stems looked thin and puny against the great butts, her cleared ground scanty. Even her cabin looked small and pitiful aside of the big timber, but it had a tight roof against the rain, stout walls against beasts and winter, a bed to sleep in, a fireplace to cook by, and gourds on clapboard shelves, spilling over with what grew in woods and patches. Hanging on her rafters, she had dittany for tea, herbs for complaints, and a jug of whiskey if you needed it, sacks of meal and grain. With these she reckoned they could make out. As she crossed the corn patch, she could hear night dogs carrying on around Panther Hill. Porteous's folks from the Bay State would think it a howling wilderness out here, but you got used to it. Last winter, young John McWhirter had to club a whole pack of night dogs on the way home from seeing the girl he was sweet on. He claimed those wolves had cured him of sparking, but next Sunday night, Cora said he was back with the girl like usual. Oh, it was a strong country out here. The woods died mighty hard. No soft living like back east. It had sloughs of work and plenty varmints, beasts and humans, but they couldn't keep folks from clearing and plowing, hunting and sugaring, visiting and celebrating some public day if they wanted. Life went on much the same out here, she reckoned, like it did back in the Bay State. Chapter 2, First Come. It was out of the ordinary for Sayward to be abed and down. One bed she had up on the loft boards. That was for overnight company, like when it got too late for somebody to go home. Her brother Wyatt's bed she had out in the shanty. That's where he wanted to be, save when he came in the cabin for rations. Osh's bed was gone. Where it used to lay, Sayward had a stool now, and the box for fancies the bound boy had made her out of hickory, bark taken from all around the tree, the outside shaved off, and with puncheons on the end to set it up on. Her and Porteous's bed was the only one left down the ladder. This bed Sayward had made new in the fall. First she littered fresh fallen leaves on the bark she had spread on the tamped dirt floor. Then she laid ticking she had sewed up herself and stuffed with corn shucks and wheat straw. Between the yarn blankets, on top of this, Sayward from time to time took her ease. Jenny and Miss Covenhoven were here looking after her. Now and then they put a fresh log on the fire or fetched water in from the run, letting the door stand open so they could see. It felt good between gripes for Sayward to lie still and let herself be waited on, hand and foot, for one time in her life. This cabin, she told herself, looking around at the smoke-stained logs, had seen death and marrying and the whole kit of the family together at the start, but this was the first time birth had ever come thumping on the door. Only Porteous wasn't here. Now wasn't that a strange notion, minding that your man wasn't around the night your and his first young one was coming in the world? If she had any sense, she wouldn't let it bother her any more than these here cramps, and she didn't mind them since they came from a little body who was closer than her own heart a-beating, and who just wanted out. Since Porteous wasn't here, she would as soon he didn't show up for a while. It was a bad enough night to get through with her sister Jenny on tenterhooks, like she was the one that had to go through birthing. Sayward had always heard say that the firstborn was the hardest to come. For a spell she hardly knew where she was at. Then she heard a fine crying like a rabbit makes when a link pulls it out of its log. It's a little boy, she heard Miss Covenhoven say in that sweet, mealy-mouthed way she kept for talk about babies and dominies, and at the time she and Big John got married. It went through Sayward's mind that now she couldn't call her baby Sully like she had made out, after her own tyke of a sister lost in the woods and never laid eyes on again. No, she would have to rake up a man's name to call him by. Light up a splinter so I can see him, she said. Miss Covenhoven gave the squalling little spindle-shanked stranger to Jenny. Then she lighted a strip of shell bark at the hearth, and held it so it would drop no fire on that tender body. Sayward looked him all over for a long time, and the sweat tasted sweet in her mouth. Never had Porteous let drop a word to her about his folks back in the Bay State, and nary a word would she ask him, but now she could see what they looked like, for this man-child of hers was no Luckett or Powley or anybody on her side of the house she had ever laid eyes on. No, this must be a Wheeler, with his big nose all ready, and sharp eyes, hardly open yet, and eye bones slanting down on the sides, like Captain Loudon, who lived in his brick mansion house along the Conestoga. She wouldn't be surprised if some relation to this little rascal with such a nose, eyes, and eye bones wasn't sitting upon a chair with a back reading a book in the Bay State right now. Sayward felt she would like to sleep, but she couldn't for watching Jenny and the baby. Oh, that mite of a pink new body, with its little bitty toes and fingers, and its weak eyes squinting from the fire, was like the little Lord Jesus to Jenny. She washed the blood off, and greased it, and wrapped it up, and rocked it backward and forward at her own childless breast. It made her look like before she was married. Then she could float along a path light as milkweed down. Wasn't it a shame Jenny never had babies of her own? She'd be like Mary in the good book, white as a magnolie, and so mortal beautiful you could hardly stand to look at her. Porteous never did come home that night. In the morning Wyatt came piddling in from his shanty with Will Beagle. Oh, they knew what was going on in the cabin last night. You could tell by the way they held back. Will come down and stayed with me last night, Wyatt said. That Sayward reckoned was to mean something, though she didn't know as yet what it was. Soon as Jenny saw them she lifted the long bundle from out of the sugar trough. Then she came up, holding the little face at her neck and rocking her upper parts softly. "Who do you reckon come to the cabin last night?" she cooed. The bound boy just stood staring at Jenny. She made a picture standing there, slim and white, with that soft bundle held up to her. A stranger might have guessed how the bound boy had been sweet on her long before she married Louis, but never would she have him. He was too young for her, Jenny claimed. "Don't you want to see a little strange body, not a day old yet?" she coaxed. "He's no stranger to me," Sayward put in warmly. "Oh, he's the smartest little old young'un you ever did see," Jenny praised, and folded down the blanket. At the face Jenny uncovered and turned to him. The bound boy looked speechless. Face looks like wild cherry pulp squeezed dry. Wyatt came out, disappointed. Yes, and yours looked the same when you was little, for I seen it, Sayward told him. Don't you want something better'n that to lay it in? Will Beagle asked. Oh, I reckon he can get along till he outgrows it, Sayward said. I could make him a fine cherry cradle, the bound boy promised. I got a block of red cherry a-dryin' under shed roof right now. This is the way I'd cut it out. He dropped to a knee and with one hand began drawing with his finger on the hard dirt floor of the cabin. Oh, he could make anything with his hands he wanted to. Staying right there on one knee, he kept figuring out the master points of that cradle, acquainting them as to how he'd cut out the parts, smooth and join them together. He might have stayed down there looking up at Sayward all day, telling where he cut the tree, whose was the best cradle he ever saw, and how he could improve on it, if Jenny hadn't called him and Wyatt to their hot mush. Soon as that was down, Wyatt got up to go, so Will had to get up from his stool too, but he didn't go. Halfway to the door he stopped. He stood there clumsy-like, and Sayward knew that either he or Wyatt would finish what Wyatt started to say at the start. I just come over last night to tell you something for Porteous, he said, but Wyatt reckoned it was no time to give you bother. Where's Porteous at? Jenny put in sharply. He said he had to go off on business, the bound boy said. He told me to tell you. Said he hoped you and Jenny could make out till he got back. Where'd he go to? Sayward asked from her bed. He had to go to the territory seat, the bound boy answered. Then he got out fast as he could. So he went to the territory seat. Sayward lay there, and her legs felt cold in her bed. Now wasn't that just like a man, running off when he knew he was going to be pappy to a young one, like he was the one that had to go through anything. Why, he was scared to come home, that's what he was. He had run from this house the night he found he had a wife to sleep with. It took him a while to get used to that. Now it would take him another while to get used to being a pappy and having a young one to dandle on his knee. What did he have to go down yonder to Chillicothe for? Now, was that the time he ought to take care of himself, when he had a babe to live for? It hadn't much danger to a master woods runner and boatman like Jake Tench, but Porteous was helpless and innocent in the woods as a settlement body. He would never even carry a gun. Oh, it had no Indian trouble around here as yet. Not out in the open anyways, but it was a-comin'. They weren't satisfied with the treaty at Greenville any more. They claimed too many whites were coming in the country. The longer she thought about Porteous, the more dark and bloody stories kept sneaking out from the back of her mind. She recollected Wilts Miller, who had joked about his long red key. Well, if they get mine, he said, they won't need a lantern to see by in the night time. And that Connecticut Yankee up in the Firelands who said I had my wife cut mine too short to make it worth their while, but he had lost his bristles just as quick as Wilts Miller his key, and neither of them had a finer head of hair than Porteous, thick and briary, and always tied with his lawyer ribbon. Savages would itch to get their bloody hands on that. I don't know as I can wait till he gets back," Jenny said. "Now don't you fret, Jenny," Sayward told her. "You go back when you made out to. I can take care of myself, and what I can't do, Wyatt can help me." The days went by, and she heard nothing of Porteous. Settler folk, one or the other, stopped most every day to see the baby. Where was Porteous? Wasn't he home? Didn't he see his own young one yet? They wanted to know. Oh, they said little more about him right out, but Sayward could tell what they thought. Savages had no pity on a man because he was pappy to a young one. They'd have no pity on that young one itself. Jerry used to tell of the little girl in Pennsylvania who ran from the corn patch when she seen the red devils comin'. "Run, Janie, run!" her mam had cried to her from the cabin. "Run, Janie, run!" The front Indian mimicked as he overtook her and fetched down his tomahawk on the child's tender head. It was a good while, as days go, till she got news of Porteous, and then Wyatt's hound fetched the first word. She was long since up and around when she heard Put carry on. She knew it couldn't be Wyatt home for mauling rails already. Besides, the step was too loud and firm for Wyatt's moccasins. It was a stern boot she heard. She had heard it before, and she wouldn't have believed the good feeling that ran along the rifles of her blood. Before he could pull the latch string, she opened the door, and there stood Porteous. His long surtout coat had been ripped by the brush, and his stovepipe beaver hat looked sorry. He came in slowly, like company in his own cabin, bussing her on the cheek, like strangers or great folks did when they had been away. This was something Sayward had waited long hours to see, her man and his young one laying eyes on each other for the first time. She had changed the baby only a short while before. The sugar trough she had set up on its end by the fire to dry. Until then she had laid the babe in their bed. He was there now, looking up with those sharp brown eyes he had, a-wondering who was this stranger man a-comin' in the cabin. But if Porteous saw anything out of the ordinary, he would give no notice. "Are you well?" he asked, for something to say, and turned to take off his surtout and hang it on its peg with his beaver on top. "I feel hearty," Sayward said, calm as she could. "Anyone here for me?" he rumbled in his deep lawyer voice. "Yes, they was," she told him. "Who was that?" "Hain't you noticed something in the cabin since you went away?" He turned his head to throw at her a quick, sharp look from his gray-green eyes, but he wouldn't look at the bed. "I sent Will Beagle over before I went," he told her. "I don't mean Will Beagle," Sayward said. He gave her another look, as if to say, "Let's leave it at that," and walked firmly by the bed, as if nothing could make him look down in it. "I have important news for you," he declared. Now what could that be? Sayward pondered. "I can't imagine," she said. "The convention has ratified the Constitution," he told her, fetching out the words with feeling and power. "I was present at Chillicothe and witnessed it. I heard the speeches and saw the document signed. Look out of the window, Sayward. This isn't the Northwest Territory you see. You now live in Ohio, one of the states of the Federal Union. Everywhere I passed on the way back, citizens are enthusiastic. I predict, Sayward, that if the tide of immigration holds, we shall have up here along the river our own small empire of prosperous fields. and farms, and that means a new county and our own seat of justice and government. Sayward kept her eyes down. If he wanted to let on that nothing more important than that had happened to him and her, she could play at it too. It looked like he had only come back so he could tell her what he saw. He was warming up to it more all the time, marching slowly back and forward on the hard dirt floor, and now he was holding forth on the politics and government of this wilderness of woods and stump patches. His rich voice rang back from the logs and loft boards, till all of a sudden his young one in bed began to get afraid at his shouts and cried out. At first Porteous gave no heed, but that little mite of his wouldn't be drowned out. He had his own opinions, and he argued back, getting redder and redder, and howling his head off till his pappy couldn't make out he wasn't there any more, but had to turn and look at this rival in his wife's bed, who dared to shout him down. The worst of it was that Sayward had laid him on Porteous's side, at the very place where Porteous was wont to lie. Oh, that was a picture, Sayward told herself. Her Bay State man, who knew the law backwards and forward, not knowing what to make of his firstborn kicking and bawling and taking his pappy's place in bed. "Hain't you something to say to him?" she asked. Porteous gave her a quick, deep, almost panic-stricken look from his fine eyes. Oh, he was wise with books and learning, and what the country should do and what it shouldn't, but he didn't know how to be a pappy. "Can't you say what you think of him?" Sayward helped out. "Is it male or female?" Porteous cleared his throat. "It's a man-child, like you," Sayward said proudly. "Well, I should say," Porteous hemmed and hawed, "that legally he could be arrested, confined, brought to trial, and fined for appropriating a bed that did not belong to him, and for disturbing the peace in such an unwarranted manner." "You scared him," Sayward protested, picking him up. Now, who would have thought Porteous would feel like that about his own flesh and blood? She asked herself. He was jealous of his own young one. That's what he was, and a young one no bigger than a minute. Wasn't that just like a man, letting his woman bear his child while he went trapsin' through the woods on something he called business, and then holding it against her afterward? She reckoned she knew why he never came around the night this little mite was born. Porteous liked to sleep just with her in his bed. He wasn't partial to a young one laying between her and him at night, and by day howling and raising Jessie when his pappy wanted to read his books or write out lawyer papers. Well, Porteous would get over that, Sayward told herself. Give her time, and she would give him more young ones than this. She would fill his cabin by day and the loft boards with their little beds at night. She would bench them at ration time around the table, thick as blackberries in the fallen timber. Let the settlement of fields and farms come. Like he said, by the time it came, he would get used to his own chicks and childer. Chapter 3. Sawmill Church. It wasn't everybody in the woods that was lucky to get to church, Sayward thought, as she seated herself with her young one and looked around the sawmill. Goshorn had pulled the irons up the river and set up the mill himself. It had an up and down saw, and Porteous poked fun at its slowness, saying the saw was up today and down tomorrow. He said that the sawyer could start a log at night and go to bed. The first slab wouldn't be ready to drop off till he got up next morning, but Sayward was glad enough for anything that would cut up the trees. Today a short square-faced log had been set up on end to lay the good book on, and the platform that the slabs dropped on was the pulpit. Why, Sayward hadn't laid eyes on a pulpit or the hide and hair of a dominie for nigh onto 15 years. Not since Jerry had taken her and Jenny on a visit to Conestoga, when they were little tykes. Green ash plank was laid at one end for the women of the congregation to sit on. At the other end the men could make out on the skids and saw carriage. The dominie stood in the middle. He had to turn his head one way to preach to the women and the other way to the men. He only had to be careful when he made a flourish that he didn't cut his hand up on the up and down saw. Now, who would have thought, Sayward told herself, that a no-good, ornery varlet like Jake Tench could have been the start of such as this? He had come back from the river settlements, bragging on Maytown. Why, he said, they even had a meeting house down there blocking the mouth of hell with a bell to ring you to meeting. Sayward had told Ellen McWhirter, and Jude had set up half the night to spell out a letter to his old dominie down in Kentucky. About 6 months afterwards, a gaunt stranger in a cocked hat and black surtout rode up on a white horse to the McWhirter improvement. He said his business was saving souls, and here were his credentials. With that he pulled the good book out of his saddlebags and read to them, "Go ye into all the world, and preach the gospel to every living creature." If Porteous hadn't scoffed at that gaunt circuit rider and his trade, Sayward mightn't have come here today. Her pappy hadn't gone to meeting hardly a day in his life, and never knew the difference. She had got Porteous and her young ones without it. If she had any sins to be forgiven, she declared she did not know what they were, but when Porteous made light of church-going, she made up her mind she would see for herself what was against this thing and what was it for. Oh, all those that came here today weren't sugar and spice, and everything that's nice. There were Buckman Toll and Iddy, who wanted to be so much up in front, and Zephon Brown, who had lent $18 to Billy Harbison on his place, and when Billy couldn't pay, had taken his improvement away from him so slick before Porteous could stop him. Oh, Zephon had one little bitty eye half shut, and one little bitty eye half open, and either one could catch a weasel asleep. Folks said Zephon could fall in the ditch, and come up with a shilling in his fist, nor was Sayward partial to Scoville Harris, who got happy one time in the trace, laying on his back and yelling, "Hallelujah," till Jake Tench dropped a bullet in his mouth, and Scoville got blue in the face from choking. But it had them that were good as gold at the meeting too. There were Mary Harbison, who Sayward never heard pass a mean word against Zephon for turning them out, and Todd Wilder's woman, and the Covenhovens, and the McFalls, and George Roebuck, who mightn't give you any overweight on the post scales, but neither would he give you any under, and up near the preacher as she could get was deaf old Granny McWhirter, who knew churches all her life. She told Sayward that betwixt the Hawks and the circuit riders They hardly ever had a chicken left on their place back in the old States, and around her were Judah and Ellen and their 6 boys and 3 girls, with more still a-comin'. The McWhirters, by hokey day, could get up a meeting house all by their own selves if they wanted. Last, but not least, was her own sister, Jenny. Sayward had seen her come out of the woods and over the logs with the Covenhovens just a little while ago. She wanted to come in where Sayward sat, but the plank sagged plumb full, and she found a place in the back where it hardly had room to lean a rail. That was room enough for Jenny. The sawmill had a roof against the rain, but no side walls. You could sit in meeting and look right out in the woods, for the mill had hardly scratched them yet. The big butts stood mighty still, like this was something they couldn't make out. They'd never seen white folks sit together so quiet and sober. When the Dominie prayed, those heathen green trees hardly moved a leaf, but when it came time for a hymn, first 2 lines read off by the Dominie, and then the same sung by the whole passel of people, the echoes came back like the trees tried to drown them out. The worst was when the Dominie passed around a pewter plate of bread, saying, "Eat this, it is the Lord's body, given for you and for me." And when he gave out a fine pewter cup of wine, saying, "Drink ye all of this, it is the blood of our Lord, shed to save you from your sins," something rang through the woods then. Oh, the woods around here had stood a long time, and seen many things, but never had they seen anything like this. It had been a good while since most of the people had too. Cruel, twisted lumps came into their faces. They must have recollected some church they went to back in the old States, with a graveyard alongside where a sister or brother, mammy or pappy, was left behind, with nobody to cut the weeds over their heads any more for Independence Day. A Welshman not long from the old country heard the hymn singing all the way up on Panther Hill, and came running down, making more racket than a gray moose through the brush. He didn't hardly know a word of English, but he could tell meeting when he heard it, even out in the woods. He was plumb out of breath. Sayward reckoned she would carry this picture of him in her mind longer than she would tote her young one in her arms. An old man in brush-whipped clothes, with eye-water coursing down his dark Welsh face. Through most of the meeting, Sayward was quiet, as a woodsy should be. All she did was get up when the rest got up, and kneel down on the chips and sawdust when the rest knelt down, and sit and nurse her young one when he wanted it. After the first sermon, they had time before the second one to stretch their legs and eat their lunch, if they were lucky to have any, or go to the river and wet their gullets, that all the preaching of hell and brimstone had parched. But once the sprinkling started, she hooked up her dress and toted that soft little red bundle forward after Jude and Ellen McWhirter, taking up their own young ones for the same reason. She had thought this all out by herself, and nary a word to Porteous. Baptizing was a woman's business. She remembered her mother saying that her 2 oldest had been lawfully sprinkled in the stone church by the Conestoga, The rest, Jerry said, she had to just give names to her own self. What else could you do out in the woods where dominies were scarce as gypsy fowl teeth? But Sayward made up her mind that wouldn't happen to her and Porteus's young one. No, this little body, drooling in her arms, and too helpless to speak out for its own self, wouldn't be just called a name, like they gave one to worse old hounds, Rex and Sarge. All the pewter basin had in it was water from the race, for Sayward saw Zephon Brown dip it. But when the dominie took it and stood there with the basin in his hand, it seemed like some change must have come over the water. With his long iron-gray hair he was like a man out of Bible times. His tight mouth looked like it would forbid you the kingdom of heaven. One or two women cringed in front of him, but Sayward stood up to him stoutly. He never asked, was she a member in good standing, for Judah leaned forward and told him he would stand up for her child and be beholden for it. All the dominie asked her was the name, and she told it. Then she watched, mighty still, as the circuit rider took her babe in his own crow-black arms and splashed cold water on that tender young head. "I baptize thee, Resolve Wheeler," he said in a loud voice, "in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." Oh, those words went through her like a sword, and strange things went through her mind with it. Never had she reckoned a Luckett would get a chance to go through such as this, or to get a taste of the bread they said was the Lord's body, and a sip of wine that they said was his blood. These were things of another world to a woodsy. All she knew was the ever forest where the roads were dim, paths coaxing you to come on, while the monster brown butts stood around, still as death, waiting for you to get lost. All her life had she lived in the woods, yet still she wasn't of the woods, and still the woods were against her. Oh, it had evil things in the woods that were older than the oldest man. The woods shut you in and fought you while you lived, and sucked up your flesh and blood with its roots after you died. Even the Indians had places in the woods they shunned, where they were afraid to go. The woods ran from way back yonder to the Illinois and the English lakes, dark as a sack and mighty as Milgus. The words she heard from the preacher today were like the first light of an open place, ahead breaking through the trees. She minded now a dream she had had last night, only this morning it was, just before she awoke. Where this place was she didn't know, but it had no woods. All the trees and brush, the big butts standing up, and the old butts laying down, the brown stumps and green moss and swampy places were gone. In their place stretched streets with brick walls and lofty brick houses. The sun on these brick walls and house fronts was something to see, red and warm as fall, with some shutters green and some shutters blue, and some doorsteps marble. High in blue sky she could see a passel of white church steeples and a great dome like a state house, and on this dome had been written, "What came ye out in the wilderness to see?" It was strange, for that was the text the circuit rider had preached on this morning. It was stranger still that she could spell it out. When she woke, she had studied over that dream a long time. Now, what did it mean, and What for place was this she saw? It must be Philadelphia, she reckoned, or Porteous's Boston, or mayhap London, across the water, where some of her people came from, for never could there be such a great town with so many brick houses and white church steeples out here in the woods of Ohio. She went back to her plank, wishing Porteous could have come along and seen his young one sprinkled. There was one more she'd like to get here. That was Wyatt, the only brother she had. It wouldn't hurt him to have his head baptized, for never had it felt water except from the run, the river, or the rain, and wherever her sister Asha was at, she hoped somebody would drag her up like a wild sow by the ear and get some holy water on her. It might wash some of the sin out and some sense in. The only one who could never be sprinkled now was Sully, if she wasn't numbered with the dead. The red devils had her, and now she would have to bear a heathen name as long as she lived. When the last hymn started, Sayward gave a start. Now who could that be a-singing behind her? It couldn't be Jenny, for Jenny claimed she couldn't sing a note, since her Louis had run off with Asha the night the painter tried to come down her chimney. And yet Sayward knew well enough. In her mind she called like Worth had the time they found Sully's little playhouse out in the deep woods. Sully, Sully, be you still alive? Only Sayward in her mind called to Jenny instead. Oh, nobody could mistake Jenny when she opened her mouth and let herself out. She must have heard this common meter somewhere before. One time would have been enough for Jenny to learn it by heart. If the Dominie wasn't here to read out the words, that wouldn't stop her. She would just sing la 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 or make up words to suit. Her voice came out without half trying, and when high notes had to be reached, she took them like a bird over the tops of the trees. Before the last verse was finished, alternately prompted and sung in couplets like the others, you just knew that could be nobody but Jenny. My friends, I bid you all adieu, I leave you in God's care, and if I never more see you, go on, I'll meet you there. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Sayward didn't dare look back, for fear she might stop her, but soon as the service was done, Jenny came up laughing, pushing her face at little Resolve, sang "Adi, Adi," and shaking her head at the D to make him laugh. Then she totted that baby around, showing him off to folks, whether they knew him or not. Do you know this little body, she would say. This is Sayard's first one. It beat all Sayward thought how good you felt toward everybody after meeting. She could even pass the time to Idie Tull and to listen to her brag how her brother could start any hymn he wanted without a fork, just so he had the words and meter, not that she listened long. Everybody was talking to some other body. When they got through, they would talk to somebody else, and when they had no more talk, they just stayed and listened to others talk, for it would be a long time till they had meeting again, and all were loath to leave each other for the lonesome woods. What Porteous would say when she got home, Sayward had no notion. Jenny and the Covenhovens came with her as far as the door, but they wouldn't come in. When Sayward entered, Porteous sat with one of his books, his eyes raised, severe, over the top of the leather, but she didn't make as though she saw it. She just stayed calm, and laid the babe in the cradle, and the bound boy had made. Then she went about her business. Porteus knew well enough where she was today. Before she left, he had looked at her stern. "Are your intentions to join the church?" he had asked her. "I ain't give it a thought yet," she had told him, "but I reckon I can if I want to." Now when Porteus saw she wasn't coming out with anything, he laid down his book and picked up his baby. He set him on his knee and made a great shakes, looking him over this way and that, as if he never clapped eyes on him before. Sayward watched him out of the corner of her eye. She guessed somebody had stopped in after meeting and told him. Now who could this young and illustrious mortal be? He boomed gravely. Is it Caesar? Is it Hannibal? Is it Virgilius? Or our master Shakespeare? I named him Resolve, Sayward mentioned. Resolve, Porteus repeated. She had thought he might not think much of such a name, preferring one he had heard back in the Bay State. Perhaps his own pappy's name, which Sayward never knew. But no, Porteus rolled the name, Resolve, over his tongue. Something rose in Sayward as she heard it. It was like a great name, called in a court-room, to come forward.